I'd already turned off half the lights when I heard the first sound of chewing coming from the kitchen. It wasn't loud. It was intimate, almost shy, like someone biting slowly to avoid attracting attention. The kind of sound you only notice because the rest of the place is dead. And KFC after 11:30 p.m. is an empty aquarium. Cold lights vibrating, smiling posters of the Colonel hanging on greasy walls, tables stacked high. The shallow echo of a space that only exists when people are talking loudly and urging people to hurry. I was alone on the closing shift. The manager left early with an excuse that didn't require much creativity. My wife, doctor, early tomorrow morning. It was up to me to finish the list. Turn off the pressure fryer, scrape the warming trays, drain the oil without splashing, scrub the assembly line, mop the floor with that bucket that always smells of warm water and yesterday's chicken. It's a ritual that numbs, a sequence of gestures that erases the day from your mind. Pull, release, pass, wipe. Everything works until you hear, in the exact center of the silence, someone chewing. I stopped dragging the squeegee. The noise came from the back beyond the cutting table near the packaging storage and the freezer. The chewing involved saliva, tongue, teeth pressing against fibers that weren't there, as if invisible flesh were being ground. The sound made its way to my ear, as if it were passing through hallways and turning the corner of my mind. I know every noise in that kitchen. The drive-thru's beep as a car passes the sensor, the metallic click of the fryer lid, the steady hum of the exhaust fan, the groan of the ice crackling in the freezer. This wasn't the restaurant at all. This was people. Hello? My voice came out low, like someone asking permission to keep breathing. No one responded, just chewing. A 2-second pause, and then an audible, thick, almost polite swallow. I swallowed hard at the same time, and for an instant the two swallows overlapped within me like mirrors. That's when I felt the first twinge of dread, the coincidence, the unrehearsed choreography. I wanted to believe it was some animal, a bold rat chewing cardboard perhaps. But rats don't swallow like that. Rats don't care to be heard. I started walking again. The squeegee thrust through me like an oar in a thick lake. Each step stuck to the floor, where the grease never completely washes away. The posters followed me with chewy smiles. As I passed the counter, the ceiling camera blinked its red dot, reminding me that someone had seen this many times before. Not someone human. The camera is not someone. And yet there are nights when I'm certain the camera understands enough to choose when to fail. I passed the ever-flickering light in the back hallway. It had performed its dying candle ritual and resolved as usual to survive a few more minutes. Behind the metal door, the double sink area glistened with fresh water. The smell of cheap detergent fought hopelessly with the lingering aroma of seasoned chicken and oil. The sound of chewing had shifted. Now it seemed to be coming from the drive-through headset, hanging on the hook next to the ordering tablet. It was impossible. The headset was sleeping, the drive-through was off. The parking sensors detected nothing because there was nothing outside but the parking lot, wet from a drizzle that came and went without warning. I brought the headset closer to my ear. The instant the shell touched my skin, the chewing stopped. The silence was a gaze. I stood still, trapped within the sound of nothingness. Then a snap, like teeth touching thin bones, came from the other end of the deadline. And a heavy breath, closer than anyone should be, calmed against my eardrum. I heard the tongue scooping up the remains of something, swirling what wasn't there, and a word almost emerged there, muffled by the act of eating. No. I yanked the phone away just in time for the word to die before it could live. The cord rattled and hit the wall, punctuating the moment with a sound too human to be a chord. I let go of the squeegee and realized my hands were shaking. I did what everyone does when they still want to explain the inexplicable to protect their own sanity. I went to the freezer. Inside any walk-in freezer, there's a presence that belongs to no one. It's the cold. It keeps things suspended, as if to say that for a few hours reality is on pause here. I opened the door, and the cold air licked my arms. Boxes of thighs, drumsticks, strips, sachets of sauce, trays of cookies in plastic, all in military order. I went in and closed the door partially, leaving a crack, because I'm the kind of person who fears being trapped where the temperature can reduce decisions to shivers. The hum of the compressor seemed like a distant sea. Inside, the sound of chewing couldn't continue. That's not how the world works. The world, as far as I still believed, respects door and wall, temperature and function. But then came a muffled crunch like someone eating under a blanket to avoid being noticed. It came from behind me, inside the freezer, where there were only boxes and my shadow, crooked in the fluorescent light. I didn't turn around right away. I listened for 1, 2, 3 cycles of biting and spat the question at the white wall. Who's there? The answer was a slower, pedagogical chew, as if teaching me to count again. The hairs on my arms stood on end, as if each were a separate ear. I turned slowly. Nothing but the boxes. Nothing but my fear converting noise into intention. I knew I was alone. I knew. But knowing is a fragile habit. I left the freezer. The light in the hallway flickered again, like someone laughing at a tired joke. I walked to the packaging area. The piles of little white buckets, lids, paper bags, napkins no one uses, straws that should have disappeared from the world but hadn't. The sound was in the sink now. In the drain, there was a movement, a small belch of sewage, the kind of noise you learn to ignore when working with dirty water. And then soon after, the chewing began again. I concentrated enough to pinpoint it. It was coming from the pipe. From the metal throat that swallows leftovers, grease, the broken pieces of long days. The drain was chewing. I moved closer, holding my breath as if trying not to become part of the environment. On the dark metal, there was a circle of shadow that seemed to pulse, but maybe it was just the light flickering. I waited for something obvious, an explanation that would make me laugh at myself 2 hours later, when I left for the bus. Nothing came. Only the intimate sound of someone eating carefully, of someone not in a hurry, of someone chewing as if time were chewable. I tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had left some accumulated remains and the secret water in the walls, a seepage, was dissolving it in a process that, strangely, mimicked dinner. I clung to this hypothesis like a child clings to a blanket in the wrong room. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten dinner. The closing shift is a kind of enforced fast. You spend hours surrounded by food, and by some cruel justice, the smell fills you without nourishing you. I grabbed a dry biscuit from the warmer. There was one left, there always is. I took a small bite, as if asking permission from my own hunger, and the sound of my chewing, clear and human, filled the kitchen. That's when I realized the other sound wasn't an echo, because the other sound continued out of my rhythm, and for the first time it became clear that there was another mouth there. We were chewing together. Me and whatever it was, and he, or it, heard me chew and sped up as if wanting to keep up or overtake or swallow me through the ear. The drive-thru's whistle exploded in the air. Beep. A car. It had to be. I ran to the window. Outside, the bright beam of headlights was gone. The parking lot was a single puddle of wet darkness. I rolled down the window out of inertia, and an old drizzle invaded the counter, wetting the rubber mat. KFC, good evening, your order, I said to the void, my hand pressing the intercom button, which was officially off. The speaker hissed, and in a whisper of teeth that couldn't quite make up for words, I heard the urge to speak again, as if the customer on the other end had their mouth too busy to answer me. The plastic of the headset, still hanging, spun a little on its hook, spun more than gravity would allow, and stopped pointing at me, like an ear waiting for my mistake. I returned to the closing list because if you don't move, you become part of what's still. I scraped the heater, lined up cutlery, put away sachets, checked expiration labels. With every gesture, the sound seemed to adjust its distance, staying at the exact edge of my reach. It was like playing tag with my own panic. I tried to sing softly, some chorus that didn't belong to me, as if building a wall of human sound in the midst of it all. The crunching subsided. Just a little. Enough for me to believe I could negotiate with it. With him. It was easier to say him than it. When I checked the camera feed on the tiny monitor in the back room, I discovered the system had recorded microcuts, 1-second jumps in which the kitchen appeared, then a faint static, then the kitchen itself, slightly different, as if an invisible hand had shrunk the scene to better fit her eyes. I inched forward and found something that couldn't be there. On the edge of the radiator, where the heat drew ghosts in the air, the crumbs I'd swept away earlier formed letters. Not with film clarity, not neatly, but enough to seem intentional. Moored. I blinked, fast-forwarded a second, and the crumbs were just crumbs. I rewound a frame, and the word was there again, a message formed by the same chance that moves leaves in the wind until they become arrows. Enough. I said this to the screen, to the drain, to the lamp, to the laminated closing manual with shift notes. My voice sounded like a stranger trying to imitate me. I decided to finish quickly. Not out of fear, but out of prudence, I told myself, like someone who puts a virtue on a withdrawal. I pulled out the trash. The black bag was surprisingly heavy for a slow day. The plastic gave under my fingers as if breathing. There was a short sound inside, of something peeling away. I didn't want to open it. I did. There were the usual remains, a bone too clean, a napkin translucent with grease, bits of packaging, a congealed sauce that seemed to have given up on being liquid. Nothing alive, nothing that chewed on its own. And yet, when I closed the bag, the sound started again beside my boot, as if it were in the sole. I lifted my foot, and the chewing moved to the other. I took a step, and the sound came with it. I stood still, and for a full second I was certain the chewing was coming from me. Not from my mouth, from some nameless place between my throat and memory. I remembered the first bucket of chicken my mother brought home on a Friday when my paycheck had been enough. The apartment smelled of joy bought for an hour. I remembered the sound of the family chewing in unison, the improvised harmony of those who hadn't had much of a chance to eat together. I remembered the emptiness afterward, and how that emptiness loves to imitate satisfaction to seem less profound. Memory was chewing with me now. I was chewing the memory, and that was why I was neither hungry nor satisfied. I was a mouth without a body, or a body without a mouth, depending on the reflex. The lights in the room up ahead went out on their own. The timer, I tried to believe. A soft breeze passed me like a tongue wetting a stamp before the letter was sealed. The chewing moved away into the hallway, stopped beneath the flickering light bulb, and remained there right in the middle of the oscillation, as if it were the bridge connecting light and dark. I took 2 steps toward the sound and heard, for the first time, the sound respond to me with the human cadence of someone seeking attention. 3 slow chews, a swallow, and a pause where my name fit perfectly. But my name didn't come. What came was the sound of the exhaust fan being turned on by no one. The air rose, dragging with it the smell of oil, and the louder noise drowned out for a brief second the intimate act of eating around me. When the exhaust fan turned off on its own, the chewing was behind me. I didn't turn around. Fear feeds on the importance you give it. I heard the 3 chews, the same as before, and the final swallow touched the skin on the back of my neck with the weight of a finger. The freezer breathed, the camera blinked, the headset swung on its hook like a hanged man searching for gravity. I saw myself, for a moment, from the outside. An employee in an empty KFC, holding a squeegee like a useless symbol, while an ownerless sound devours the world around me one bite at a time. Some terrors are beasts with teeth. Others are the act of teeth without the beast. "I'll lock it," I said. It was a lie I wanted to turn into truth. I walked to the back door. The cold padlock in my hand anchored me to a simple ritual. I turned the key, and at that moment I heard one last full sound in the kitchen. Not chewing, but the preparation of chewing, saliva organizing, the tongue positioning itself, the mouth opening wide enough to accommodate what it wants to devour. And I also heard the most human sound of the night. Footsteps. Slow. Barefoot. On the floor I had washed. They weren't coming from outside. There was no way. They were coming from the space between the sink and my fear, from the point where my shadow meets the shadow of things and decides that someone lives there. I closed the back door with a click that seemed ridiculously small. The hallway suddenly grew narrower, and the light chose its moment to fail completely. The kitchen plunged into a darkness that had a contour. I didn't scream. The chewing resumed, closer than any sound can be without being sound. And I thought, with a lucidity that sometimes only night gives, that perhaps that mouth had always been there, fed by every hour of work, by every rush, by every order, by every smell that lingers after the food is gone. Perhaps I had always been the noise it waited for to have the courage to exist. I reached out in the darkness and touched the cold steel of the table. The metal returned my gesture like neutral skin. I could have sworn there was a breath in the air too hot for the early morning clock. I took a step forward and the sound followed me, meticulously, as if we were dancing. The tip of my shoe hit something, and a plastic bag sighed. The silence that followed was so complete I heard my own heartbeat chew away seconds. It was then that I felt, without seeing, the breath of whatever was behind me creeping up my neck. It didn't smell like anything I could name, not food, not us. It was the smell of the space between one bite and the next, and in that interval before the next chew began, I understood that if I spoke, my voice would escape along with whatever was feeding on me. So I didn't speak. I remained still, waiting for the sound to choose me or spare me, like someone waiting for the first drop before the right rain. The chewing started again, just inside my left ear. The sound inside my ear wasn't a sound. It was crunching flesh, saliva dragging pieces of it, the snap of cartilage that didn't belong to anyone alive. I pushed my finger against my left ear like someone trying to squash an insect inside their head, but the noise continued, steady, intimate, chewing from within. Worse, I could feel the warm air of their breath between my thoughts. I can't explain how, but each bite seemed to gnaw not only at the silence, but also at my memory. As the sound rang out, images faded from my mind like shop windows being slammed shut in succession. My mother's face, the bus that always took me to my shift, the song I hummed while cleaning. Everything faded until only the dirty present of that kitchen remained. I knew memories still existed, but they were being consumed, swallowed, digested within me. I tried to run to the front of the room, but each step was swallowed up as well. The sound of my sneakers against the floor faded, as if the chewing was devouring even the noise I was making. The world grew increasingly deaf, increasingly empty, until only one thing remained audible: the act of him eating. It was like being trapped inside an invisible mouth reduced to seasoning. When I reached the counter, I noticed that the hanging televisions, the ones that always play old commercials and promotional announcements, were all on. And they all showed the same silent scene. Myself, standing inside the empty room with my back to the camera. But something was wrong. The me on the screens was chewing. My cheeks moved as if full, my jaw moved back and forth, and my eyes were fixed on a point the camera couldn't see. I looked at my hands, touched my mouth, but I wasn't chewing anything. Still, the urge to swallow grew in my throat. When I realized it, I tasted like old oil and blood on my palate. The reflex to spit came, but my body didn't obey. It was as if my mouth were being rented by another presence. I only felt the imaginary food sliding down my throat, pushing my breath away. Behind the counter, one of the screens flickered. The recording me stopped chewing, slowly turned his face until he was facing the camera directly, and smiled. It was an empty, mechanical smile, as if his mouth had forgotten how to smile but insisted nonetheless. I froze before the image. Then, the monitor me opened his mouth and dropped a dark, wet piece which ricocheted onto the screen floor. At the same moment, something hit the real floor, right behind me. I didn't have the courage to turn around immediately. The wet sound trickled out of the kitchen across the freshly mopped floor. When I finally looked, I saw a piece of fried chicken lying on the floor. But it wasn't chicken. The texture resembled human muscle, red fiber covered in a golden crust that still smoldered. The smell was sweet and metallic, a mixture of food and wound. The piece moved. It didn't slide. It chewed itself. The fibers vibrated in short waves, and the crust snapped like teeth. I backed away until I felt the counter on my back, and every inch I retreated, another piece fell out of nowhere. A dry crack, a wet impact, until there were several of them scattered across the floor, all crunching in unison, all repeating the same sound that had already filled my head. The living room light flickered 3 times and then went out, leaving only the brightness of the kitchen behind me. And it was in this contrast that I realized the shadows on the walls no longer belonged to me. There were mouths open in the darkness, just the outlines of teeth and suspended jaws, chewing silently, but I could hear each one inside my skull. I considered fleeing through the front door, but the window no longer showed the street. Where the wet parking lot had been, there was now only a corridor of endless flesh, pulsing, chewing on itself as if it were an organism feeding on its own body. I was trapped. And more than trapped, I was being transformed. Each chewing sound that echoed in my ear was accompanied by a new emptiness within me. Pieces of my voice, my name, my childhood, all silently ripped away and swallowed by that invisible presence. And then, amidst all the chewing noise, a voice finally emerged, misshapen, choked, as if it had been stitched together from the remains of voices. You already have taste. I felt my tongue move on its own, brushing against my teeth as if searching for something to bite. The sweet metallic taste intensified, saliva flowing excessively. I was hungry. Hungry for what, I didn't know. But the mouth inside me already knew. Hunger began to spread like a fever. It wasn't hunger in my stomach, it was hunger in my mouth. A desire to chew anything, any object, any part of me that could make the sound echo louder. My teeth chattered on their own, clashing, clicking, trying to pluck invisible crumbs from the air. My tongue seemed to grow, dragging itself along my gums like a trapped animal seeking escape. I wanted to scream. I wanted to use my voice to interrupt that choreography of bones. But every attempt to speak became another chewing sound, as if my throat had forgotten how to be a throat and only remembered how to be a grinder. When I tried to say my name, the sound of bones breaking came out. When I tried to say, "Help," I heard the snap of cartilage being ripped away. I ran to the staff restroom. The light flickered, reflecting a mosaic of dirt and worn mirrors on the wall. I leaned against the stained glass to look at myself, to see if the face was still mine. But what I saw wasn't a reflection. It was a delay, as if I were watching myself on a broadcast seconds apart. My face stared back at me and then opened its mouth on its own, before I could do the same. Inside that mouth, there was no tongue or teeth, only darkness, a pulsating wet darkness that chewed on nothingness and spat out the sound inside my head. I touched my own face with my hand, trying to feel if the flesh was still there. It was, but in the mirror, there was nothing, only emptiness ruminating, as if the mirror were a window to what already lived inside me. I knocked on the glass. The reflection laughed with missing teeth. Then, for the first time, it spoke clearly. "You're just another counter. Food always needs a counter." I felt the air thin, and the phrase sounded like a sentence, not a metaphor. My entire body now seemed part of the restaurant, my skin, an oily table, my blood, boiling oil, my bones, discarded chicken bones. I was just another utensil, another surface for the eternal act of chewing. From the hallway came shuffling footsteps. They weren't human. They were like sacks of meat being dragged across the floor. With each drag, a chewing sound accompanied it, as if the movement itself were chewing. The bathroom door moved slowly. I locked it with the latch, but I heard teeth pressing into the wood on the other side. They didn't scratch. They didn't punch. They bit. The sound of fibers being eaten penetrated the door like skin. I began to pray silently, or so I thought. But before I knew it, the prayer had no words. They were chewed up too. It was as if each syllable had been replaced by grinding teeth. There was no more language, only digestion. The doorknob turned. The latch held, but I sensed it was no use. The smell that seeped through the cracks was the same as the pieces that had fallen into the dining room. Sweet, metallic, meat disguised as fast food. The entire bathroom began to tremble, as if the building were just a giant mouth, swallowing the employees one by one night after night without ever choking. I closed my eyes. Within the darkness, I saw another mouth. Not mine, not the reflections, A mouth made of all mouths, with endless rows of repeating teeth chewing in circles, chewing until the sound no longer fit in the silence. When I opened my eyes, the bathroom was gone. I was in another space, a corridor made of pulsating flesh, wet, endless, and every step I took was swallowed up behind me, erased as if it had never existed. And there, in the back, was a table illuminated by a solitary fluorescent light. On top of it, a bucket of KFC filled to the brim, but inside, there was no chicken. There were human hands, fingers still moving, trying to break free of the golden crust. The smell was unbearable, and at the same time, irresistible. My mouth filled with saliva, and before I could resist, the voice inside my head whispered, "Now it's your turn to chew." I felt my teeth chatter on their own. I stood before the bucket, the buzzing of the light bulb popping in my head as if it were the only real sound in the world. But it wasn't. The real sound was still the chewing, which now came from within me and without in unison, like an invisible choir reciting a mass of teeth. The fingers inside the crust moved in spasms. Some were still whole, others broken at odd angles, their skin translucent from frying, bubbles of fat slowly bursting. One of them dragged his fingernail along the side of the bucket, leaving a thin scratch, almost a cry for help. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were mesmerized. It was as if the sight were a magnified version of a memory, an echo of all the times I'd opened a similar bucket and reached in without thinking. My mouth began to ache. My teeth gnashed on their own, searching for something to break. Saliva dripped, hot and thick. I put my hand to my face to try to control it, but my tongue slipped between my lips and licked the air, as if I could already taste it. The sweet metallic scent filled my lungs, and before I knew it, I was breathing deeply, sucking in the smoke of addiction like an addict. A finger detached itself from the mound, falling to the ground with a squishy sound. It remained there, pulsing slowly until it stopped. I crouched down, almost on all fours like a dog finding a forbidden bone. I touched the finger. It was hot. Too hot. When I touched it to my lips, I felt the burnt skin, the crispy fat, and the flavor I shouldn't recognize. But I did. It was the taste of my own mouth, as if I were chewing on myself, as if each bite were merely confirmation that I had never existed apart from it. The chewing inside my head exploded into applause. It was as if dozens of mouths were celebrating in sync. I bit down. The crack echoed like glass breaking in slow motion. The flesh crumbled into fibers between my teeth, and the sensation wasn't revulsion. It was relief. It was like quenching an old thirst, a thirst I couldn't name. Before I knew it, I was kneeling before the bucket, my hands entwined in that mass of fingers and palms, pulling pieces, chewing and swallowing without pause. Blood mixed with oil dripped down my chin, falling to the floor in dark pools that seemed to grow alive. I was no longer the one eating. I was the one being eaten from within. At some point, I opened my eyes and no longer saw the bucket. I saw the restaurant, the tables, the posters, the kitchen behind. But everything had changed. Every table was made of tied bones, every chair of dried tendons, every lamp dripped with grease. The Colonel's poster smiled with a mouthful of human teeth, chewing too. Everything was chewing. The whole world was chewing. I tried to spit, tried to stop, but my jaw wouldn't obey. With each bite, I felt my consciousness give way. What was left of me as a human screamed inside my skull, but the scream was swallowed by the incessant chewing. And it was at that moment that I heard the final sentence, clear, undisguised, coming from all directions at once. "You never worked here. You were always the food." And chewing now was my only voice. I no longer knew if I was standing, kneeling, or lying down. My body had become secondary, a structure merely to support the ceaseless chewing. Every muscle felt like a jaw, every heartbeat a snap of teeth grinding invisible bones. I breathed in gulps, blinked in gulps, thought in gulps. I looked around. KFC was no longer the restaurant I knew. The counter had become a row of open mouths, swallowing and spitting saliva like living machines. The walls throbbed, covered in pulsating flesh that stretched and retracted, like a breathing stomach. The floor was no longer a floor, it was a tongue. A rough, endless tongue, where my every step was greeted like a new seasoning. The ceiling cameras moved on their own. They didn't rotate in search of surveillance, but in a slow, chewing motion, like eyes trying to digest what they saw. The screens, on in the room, showed different versions of me. On each I ate without stopping. On one screen I devoured pieces of cardboard, on another I bit my own hands, on another I chewed on nothing and still swallowed, happily. None of those images obeyed my present. They were possibilities, futures, or pasts that I couldn't differentiate. In the midst of this feast of distortions, an idea crept into my mind, but it wasn't mine. Don't fight. Every sound wants to become chewing, even silence. And then I heard it. The silence was chewing too. The silence was breaking into small fragments, shattering into cracks. Silence had a taste. I felt the metallic tang of it sliding down my throat, and I realized the whole world was just food. Nothing was solid. Nothing was eternal. Everything was destined to become smaller pieces inside a larger mouth. The posters on the walls began to speak to me, but not with words, with synchronized chewing sounds that formed soundless sentences. I understood each one in my mind. You chew because you exist. You exist because you chew. The mouth never closes. The mouth is the world. Little by little, I noticed my skin beginning to crack. It wasn't blood that was oozing. It was rows of teeth growing, multiplying across my arm, my chest, my neck. Each new mouth chewed indiscriminately, like hungry parasites that had always lain dormant within me. I tried to scream, but the scream came out as another bite. And then finally I understood. There was no longer a division between me and the restaurant, between me and the sounds, between me and the thing I'd been chewing since the beginning. I was just another corridor inside the infinite stomach. An employee who never existed, a customer who never left, a piece that had always been on the menu. In the reflection of the shop window, I saw my face for the last time. It smiled with dozens of jaws opening and closing in a cascade, and spoke to them all at once. Welcome to the menu. And the whole world closed in on me, chewing. There was no longer any difference between opening my eyes or closing them. Everything was mouth. Every shadow on the ceiling folded into gums. Every drop of grease on the floor was dripping saliva. Time didn't exist, only chewing. The digital clock behind the counter read Ori every minute, as if the world had stopped the moment I was swallowed. I wondered, or maybe it was just another chewing thought, if anyone still existed outside. If there were customers on the street, buses running, children asking for toys. But every attempt to imagine anything beyond that dissolved like stale bread between teeth. Reality ground down and descended into the dark throat of the kitchen. It was then that I heard the drive-through bell ring. A bip cut through the chewed-up silence, so clear it seemed impossible. I dragged myself to the counter, each step accompanied by mouths opening on the soles of my feet. The window was shrouded in steam, as if there was only breathing outside. I grabbed the headset with hands that weren't just hands anymore. They were utensils. They were articulated jaws. I placed it on my head. On the other side, silence, but not empty silence. The silence that chews slowly. Then the voice came, low, wet, made of crackles. Your order has already been placed. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the question came out like a bite. The headset cracked against my ear, creaking as if it were made of bones. On the other end, the same voice repeated, clearer. You are the order. The air vanished. The lamps all burst simultaneously, spewing sparks that fell like broken teeth. The entire kitchen drew in a deep breath as if preparing to swallow. Then I felt it. It wasn't just hunger inside me anymore. It was the world chewing me up from the inside out. Every wall pressed in, crunching my bones. Every table gnashed like steel teeth. I was being digested by something that would never end. And yet, amid the absolute terror, a morbid peace took hold. Because there was no more choice, no more struggle, The only real sound was chewing, and I was part of it. I was him. My last words, if they can still be called words, were a muffled whisper, swallowed before I came out. Enjoy. And then everything shut down. The kitchen, the KFC, the city, the country, the planet. A single jaw closing in on itself, crushing reality and memory until it became nothing. Until it became only the taste of chewing. The next morning, the manager opened the KFC as usual. The smell of stale chicken was still there, permeating the walls. The lights were on as usual. The cameras showed an empty shift, nothing unusual. There was only one difference, the timesheet. On the last page, a name hastily signed. Mine. No departures recorded. The manager frowned, scratched his head, and muttered, "That guy always complained about the night shift. He must have quit for good." He didn't see the detail. He didn't see that the paper was damp, stained with grease, as if it had been bitten before drying. In the kitchen, the drain made a soft pop. A small sound, almost like bones crunching. And anyone paying attention, anyone brave enough to put their ear to the metal, could hear very faintly someone chewing inside, and chewing non-stop.